Welcome back to America's Fractured Politics. Restoring election integrity after years of Trumpist sabotage requires treating democracy as infrastructure, something that must be rebuilt, hardened, and constantly maintained, not a background assumption that will take care of itself. It means directly confronting a movement that has learned how to rig the rules in advance through voter suppression, gerrymandering, captured courts, and weaponized fraud narratives, rather than just hoping to beat it at the ballot box. Donald Trump did not invent voter suppression, gerrymandering, or racially targeted barriers to the ballot, but he did something new and dangerous. He turned the lie of a stolen 2020 election into a permanent permission slip for sabotaging future ones. Under the banner of election integrity, Republican officials across the country have embraced a new playbook. Instead of persuading more people to support them, they change who counts as the people in the first place. That means aggressive purges of voter rolls that conveniently sweep away young voters, urban voters, and voters of color. It means closing polling places in neighborhoods that don't vote the right way, then shrugging when people wait in line for hours or give up and go home. It means installing partisan actors in positions that used to be boring, technocratic jobs, positions like county election supervisor or secretary of state, and then giving those actors new powers to throw out ballots, take over local boards, or even threaten to find the votes their side needs. Layered on top of that is a campaign of harassment and intimidation directed at the people who make elections work: the poll workers, the county clerks, the election volunteers. The message is clear. If you count votes fairly and the wrong side wins, your job, your safety, even your freedom can be on the line. But the most dangerous move is more subtle. Trump's movement has redefined what counts as a fair election. In this upside-down world, an election is suspect whenever their side loses and legitimate whenever their side wins, no matter how many rules were bent to get there. It's not just about contesting particular results. It's about contesting whether elections should be allowed to deliver outcomes they don't like at all. The core problem in American democracy today is not mutual distrust between two equal camps. It's that one party, backed by an increasingly ideological Supreme Court, is systematically reshaping the rules so that it never has to face a truly competitive election again. For a long time, many Americans treated the Supreme Court as the adult in the room, a neutral referee that would step in when politicians went too far. On voting rights, that myth is gone. Over the last decade, the court has hollowed out the Voting Rights Act, the crown jewel of the civil rights era. It has dismantled the pre-clearance system that once required jurisdictions with a history of racial discrimination to get federal approval before changing their voting rules. The message to states that wanted to make it harder for certain people to vote was simple. The cop is off the beat. At the same time, the court has shrugged at, and in some cases, effectively blessed hyper-partisan gerrymandering, maps drawn with surgical precision to lock in one party's power, even when it loses the popular vote in a state. In practice, that means a party can lose the statewide vote for a legislature and still walk away with a comfortable majority of seats. When that happens, those insulated majorities are free to pass even more extreme voting restrictions, creating a feedback loop of minority rule. The cumulative effect is staggering. The court has not just failed to protect democracy, it has become a key instrument in its erosion. When legislatures redistricts, purge voters, and tilt the playing field, they no longer worry that a federal court will stop them. They count on this court to look away, or worse, to dress partisan outcomes in constitutional language. So when we talk about restoring election integrity, we cannot pretend that the Supreme Court is a neutral umpire that will eventually save us. Any serious pro-democracy agenda has to grapple with the court itself, how it is chosen, how long its members serve, what ethical rules bind them, and which kinds of election cases it should have the last word on, and finally, how many members the court should have. If you want to keep a house from collapsing, you start with the foundation. For American democracy, that foundation is the right to vote and have that vote counted on equal terms. Right now, that foundation is cracked because it depends almost entirely on which state you happen to live in. In one state, you can register easily. vote early and drop your ballot in a secure box on your way to work. In another, you navigate a maze of ID rules, restricted hours, and long lines, especially if you live in a city or in a tribal land, if you're a student. Restoring integrity means building a national floor below which no state can sink. That starts with reviving and expanding the parts of the Voting Rights Act that have been gutted. Bringing back some version of preclearance so that jurisdictions with patterns of discrimination can't change voting rules in the dark. But that's just the beginning. A modern democracy needs a modern voting rights floor. That means automatic voter registration when people interact with government agencies, and same-day registration so that bureaucratic mistakes or last-minute moves don't become a reason to silence someone's voice. It means robust early voting and mail voting options so that work schedules, child care, and disability are not secret poll taxes. It means strict limits on mass voter purges, clear standards for keeping the rolls accurate without weaponizing maintenance to kick the wrong voters off. Finally, a national floor means explicit protections against partisan interference and ballot counting. Who runs the count, who certifies results, and under what standards should not be left to the whims of whichever party controls the state house in a given year. There should be clear federal rules. If you meet the legal requirements, your ballot is counted. If you win more votes, you win. Period. These are not radical ideas. They're the bare minimum for a system that wants to call itself a democracy. One of the smartest and darkest insights of the Trump era was this: you don't have to stuff ballot boxes if you can control the people who oversee the boxes. Election administration has traditionally been an unglamorous job. County clerks, local boards, state-level officials quietly handled registrations, machines, ballots, and certification. Most of them were partisans on paper, but the culture of the work was boringly nonpartisan. Count them all, get it right, go home. Trump and his allies set out to change that culture. They recruited election deniers to run for offices that oversee voting. They turned obscure technical jobs into partisan battlegrounds. They encouraged their supporters to monitor polling places in ways that sometimes shaded into harassment. And they built a media ecosystem that brands any official who refuses to bend the rules as a traitor. And there's worse. Let's face it, there is some persuasive evidence that Trump tampered with the 2024 election. That must never be allowed to happen again. The result is an atmosphere where dedicated public servants, many of them Republicans, have faced death threats, doxing, and campaigns to drive them from office simply for doing their jobs. The goal is not just revenge, it's replacement. Scare out the professionals, install loyalists, and the next time a close race needs to be corrected, the right people will be in the right positions. To restore election integrity, the United States needs to professionalize and insulate election administration the way other democracies do for judges or central bankers. That means shifting from highly politicized election officials to nonpartisan or genuinely bipartisan boards with clear qualifications and staggered terms. It means statutory protections against intimidation, harassment, and bad faith prosecutions of election workers. Protections with teeth, including criminal penalties and federal backup. And it means guaranteed funding for local election offices so that they aren't left understaffed, undersecured, and dependent on partisan legislatures that can quietly sabotage them with budget cuts. If we want election workers to treat democracy as a public service, we have to treat them as something better than expendable cannon fodder in someone else's culture war. Even the fairest voting rules will not save democracy if the structure of representation is rigged to convert minority support into majority power. Here's how the cycle works. Gerrymandered maps give one party more seats than it deserves based on the statewide vote. Those insulated majorities then pass ever harsher voting restrictions, confident they won't be punished at the polls because the maps already guarantee their survival. Over time, the gap between voter preferences and legislative outcomes widens, and voters lose faith that their ballots matter. Breaking this cycle requires structural reform, not just better behavior. Independent redistricting commissions are one of the most promising tools. When lines are drawn by citizens or bipartisan panels, operating under clear rules, compactness, respect for communities of interest, genuine competitiveness, It becomes much harder for politicians to pick their voters instead of the other way around. Where possible, state constitutions can entrench these commissions. At the federal level, Congress can set baseline criteria and ban partisan gerrymandering as a primary motive in drawing districts. As long as the current Supreme Court signals that extreme partisan maps are beyond its concern, reform will be a state-by-state slog. That's why any long-term project to restore election integrity must consider reforms to the court itself. Term limits that prevent any one generation from freezing constitutional meaning for decades. Binding ethics rules to reduce obvious conflicts of interest, and carefully targeted jurisdictional reforms that keep the most nakedly partisan election disputes out of hands. As said before, 13 justices. These ideas may sound radical only because Americans are trained to treat the current system as a natural order of things. It isn't. It's a choice. And if that choice is producing systematic minority rule, it can and should be revisited. Even then, it's fair to ask, even if all of these reforms are technically possible, are they politically realistic? Why would a party benefiting from the current system vote to make it fair? The hard truth is that no single law will save American democracy, and no single election will either. What's needed is a pro-democracy movement that treats the rules of the game as core issues, not as process questions, too boring or complicated for ordinary people to care about. That starts with rebuilding the institutions that can carry that message. Unions that explain to members why voter suppression isn't an abstract problem, but a workplace issue. Local media that treats attacks on election workers as front-page news, not footnotes. Grassroots voting rights organizations that do the unglamorous work of knocking doors, educating voters, and challenging bad laws. It also requires a shift in how major political actors talk about democracy. For too long, the party that still believes in pluralism has shied away from telling the story plainly, afraid of sounding shrill or partisan. Meanwhile, the anti-democracy faction has had the field to itself, branding every modest reform as a plot to steal elections. Pro-democracy politicians and commentators need to be as blunt as the threat requires. They need to say over and over that this is not a fight over which party gets a slightly larger tax cut or a slightly different health care plan. It's a fight over whether citizens retain the power to fire their rulers and the need to model what democracy looks like by accepting losses in fair contests. The goal here is not to rig the rules in the other direction, to create a permanent blue America. It's to lock in a system where both sides can win, both sides can lose, and both sides accept the results because the process is visibly fair. So where does that leave us? It leaves us with a choice. The United States can continue down the path mapped out by Trump and the current Republican Party, a path where election integrity is a euphemism for targeted disfranchisement. Partisan election boards, gerrymandered chambers, and a Supreme Court that reflexively sides with those who would narrow the electorate. Or it can choose a different meaning for integrity, one where the rules are transparent, the referees are independent, and the outcome is uncertain enough that nobody can bank on permanent power. Restoring election integrity in the wake of Trumpism means drawing a bright, non-negotiable line. Politicians are entitled to compete for power, not to pre-decide the outcome by sabotaging the democracy that gives their power legitimacy in the first place. If democracy is infrastructure, then this is the maintenance moment. The cracks are visible, the stress fractures are audible. The question is whether the country will patch them, reinforce them, and build something stronger, or wait until the collapse makes the choice for us. Look, I know that we cannot make all of these changes now with the Republicans in charge. But what we can do is chase them down, keep them from abusing their privilege, and make sure that at the end of the day, we make enough noise so that they can't cheat.